So, how do you see the role of safeguards growing concomitantly with the digital economy, not just in India, but globally?
Yeah. I think when you think about the digital economy more broadly, there's this trilemma you often face. One, that of the first being that of innovation. How do you innovate? How do you bring new digital goods and services to the market? The second one is addressing public interest, and that could be a range of public interest. And the third one is often around consumer choice, individual interests, and these are the concerns you also flagged in your question.
Welcome to another episode of Justify. In the 20th century, borders were drawn with barbed wire and brick walls. But in the 21st, they are crafted in code and firewalls. As states assert greater control over digital infrastructure and data flows, the question arises, can traditional legal frameworks evolve in this fast evolving domain? Joining us today is Dr. Neha Mishra, whose work explores how global legal regimes intersect with digital trade, data governance, and state sovereignty. Neha has examined how countries, especially in the global south, are asserting digital sovereignty while also navigating risks of surveillance, fragmentation, and regulatory overreach. Today, we'll unpack the legal architecture and the contradictions of the international digital landscape. Just a little bio about Neha. Neha is an assistant professor at the Geneva Graduate Institute, where she specializes in international trade law, digital governance, and legal dimensions of emerging technologies. Her work explores how international trade regimes intersect with data flow, cybersecurity, and AI ethics. Her recent book, which I encourage everyone to pick up, International Trade Law and Global Data Governance, examines how international trade agreements apply to domestic regulations on cross border data flows. This is something that we particularly felt is relevant when India was drafting the DPDP Act, and I hope that we get into some of that. Neha has advised the UNCTAD and the ESCAP, and her publications reflect a critical engagement with policy challenges in South Asia. She's earlier taught at the ANU in Australia and was a postdoctoral fellow at the NUS Center for International Law. Most importantly, Neha and I went to school together at the National Law School, Bangalore, where we were batchmates for 5 years. So, this is a reunion of sorts. Welcome to Justify, Neha. So, Neha, let's dive straight in. As the digital economy expands, and it expands in a variety of different ways all across the world, there is a lurking sense of skepticism in terms of what the security risks might be, what the privacy risks might be as part of this expansion. So in India, for example, most recently, there have been when Digi Yatra was introduced, which is the facial recognition technology used to enter airports, while people applauded the efficiency benefits, there was also quite a bit of skepticism in terms of what's happening to my data. So, how do you see the role of safeguards growing concomitantly with the digital economy, not just in India, but globally?
Yeah. So thank you, Olga, for the question. I think when you think about the digital economy more broadly, there's this trilemma you often face. One, that of the first being that of innovation. How do you innovate? How do you bring new digital goods and services to the market? The second one is addressing public interest, and that could be a range of public interest. And the third one is often around consumer choice, individual interests, and these are the concerns you also flagged in your question. Now, if you take the South Asian context, then it becomes very specific. The first problem could be that of digital education. There is more access to the internet, but that does not mean there is no digital divide, and that's a big problem to start with. This also means there's less awareness of how digital technologies work, and you have to think about, if you think of South Asia as a whole, there are people who are extremely well aware, digitally aware, but there are lots and lots of people also who do not have that degree of digital education. Then there's the perception towards privacy protection, which can be very specific in the South Asian context. It's very different from, let's say, the EU or in Switzerland, where I live right now. The third problem in the Indian context could be also the nature of innovation. It's often very rapid. It can often also be a little haphazard. It can be disruptive. And there are periods in which it may be completely unnoticed and therefore also not regulated properly by the relevant regulatory authorities. On top of that, South Asian countries, including India, they have problems of regulatory capacity that can be limited. And to top all these concerns, there's also geopolitical considerations. Where's the technology coming from? And this is a question we hear across the world now. And there's also concerns regarding how to engage with different international partners on many aspects of these digital regulations. So when you try to put all of this together, therefore designing safeguards is not an easy task, even for a country like India, where there is such rapid digital disruption and a high degree of understanding of how the digital economy is expanding. For me, the way I look at it, a core safeguard is addressing the digital divide and addressing questions of digital education as a basic fundamental. And this is not only for people who are well educated, but also for the large populations who are using the internet on their mobiles and who may not really understand the implications
No,
of
that's
a
a
lot of.
great point. And if I can just stop you for a moment there.
Yeah,
So you you hit the nail on the head that there is, of course, a digital divide, and
mm,
and even in parts where there may be some access to the internet, the fact is that digital literacy is poor. So when
yeah,
you think about it as a safeguards issue, what are the kinds of measures that you think
mm,
could be taken to
yeah.
bridge this divide and increase the levels of literacy across the board? And specifically, what role do you see for the state and the
Mm,
market? Because I'm guessing
yeah,
both have to play a role here. It can't
yeah,
just be the state
yeah,
in devising these safeguards.
yeah. It's very interesting. I think it's a much bigger question. It's a challenge not only for South Asia, as a challenge across even the richer world. I think the first question would be about how to develop the right curriculum for digital education. So this is starting from the very basic schooling, primary schooling, because if you learn it as a kid, you learn it much faster.
So, what do you
Uh,
learn? What do you learn
you
in?
learn you would learn what are the different kinds of technologies, what is safe use of digital technologies, and that's become very common curriculum in many Western countries, where especially there are concerns around how kids are engaging with social media. um, there is another initiative which is quite common in many Western countries and perhaps something worth thinking about in the Indian context, which is using community centers, particularly in rural and suburban areas, to train older people how to use digital technologies, which I think is not a very high risk investment, but can have very high payoffs in the long run, especially if you think about how many older people now struggle with digital technologies and do not really understand what's going on. And they can also fall victims to a lot of online crimes and different kinds of frauds. So I think that kind of initiative would be very helpful from a state perspective. From a private sector perspective, I think a lot of it is just prescriptive, it's because you have different laws and regulations and there are certain requirements, but we have seen some failures on that front. So for instance, most data protection laws now have very extensive provisions on informed consent. But the reality is that even if companies do all kinds of maneuvers to try and get informed consent, it does not work so efficiently in practice because everyone is in a hurry when they're using digital technologies and they're not even going to read that one-page notice. So it is difficult for the private sector. And so far, what has happened is because there are all these compliance burdens under different kinds of data protection laws or other requirements in domestic laws that companies have to tailor their technologies to match those requirements. So I think from the private sector perspective, I don't have very clear ideas yet. And I
Hmm.
perhaps think that the future might also be driven by regulation rather than initiatives which are taken voluntarily by the private sector.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we are somewhere, as I like to describe this, as in we are stuck currently in a low level compliance equilibrium trap, where I think there's that basic level of compliance that all private parties are doing. And beyond that, the fact is that neither is there regulation nor is there a desire to actually ensure that people know the what they are doing on the internet. I mean, what they are consuming and what's happening with their data.
Yeah.
And I think as consumers, of course, we are responsible, because we
Yeah.
are as culpable as the next person, because we want
Yeah.
to download that app and order that
Yeah.
food in that instance. But as you rightly said, as in the digital divide, bridging is a journey, and I think it needs the state and the private sector. So
Yeah.
let me dive into the role of the state in this, because your work is also on digital trade, and the nature of digital trade, of course, is changing, because the geopolitical nature of the world itself is changing with the rise of large tech corporations. So the question that arises is that in India, the state has been seen both as the facilitator of some kind of big tech, and this is broadly the DPI
Mm,
ecosystem
mm,
across areas. This has also been fueled by a data colonization narrative,
mhm,
which is essentially that we need to ensure that data is used in a way that benefits Indians, and the state, at least in a traditional conception, is the custodian of that. It's an accountable elected government, as opposed to an unaccountable unelected private corporation. So, how do you see the role of the state in the digital economy in the global south? Do you see it primarily as a regulator, because you talked about regulation as being critical, or do you see it also as, in some senses, a provider?
Um, so yeah, actually, just going back to the last point that you said about consumers, I think when consumer awareness levels change, sometimes things which were not so important for private companies also change. So, for instance, privacy. If you are in a market where consumers are very interested in privacy, then privacy also becomes a factor in competing with each other. So if that becomes a matter of, if it's a dynamic in the competition in the market, then companies are likely to be more privacy compliant. So I think starting with the consumer through state intervention can make a big difference. I just wanted to go back to that point. On the question of data colonialism, many of your listeners might know that data colonialism narrative was heavily influenced by critical theory and post-colonial studies, and the idea was about the vicious nature, because if you have big tech companies that are able to collect a lot of data, they become data monopolies. That gives them advantage in the market. They can create new products and services and capture even more users, and therefore you completely close off the market and you create this vicious loop. And if there were a dozen companies, especially Western companies, say from the US, also increasingly from China, who have captured that market, it almost shuts out other companies from entering the market. That's the basic idea behind it. And a lot of statistics actually prove that this pattern exists, right? There are a lot of big tech companies who are dominating this market. And a lot of profits which are generated also seem to be limited to a few countries and to a few companies. But one has to be cautious about treating data the same way as treating any other natural resource, because that's also an inspiration for this entire narrative, that this is like our natural resource, it should not be exploited. Now, when you take it to an Indian context, I don't think it's such a black and white story, because it's worth thinking, where are we listening, or where are all these data colonialism narratives so visible? So, if, for instance, we hear it a lot in the context of when the government is thinking about what kind of e-commerce policy should we have, what kind of AI regulation should we have. There was a lot of discussion of this around the national framework for non-personal data regulation, how data should be shared. Of course, you mentioned the personal data protection law. There was a lot of discussion around data colonialism in that context. And in the trade context, again, India has been very active in bringing these dialogues to the WTO, to other trade fora to discuss how digital colonialism or data colonialism might be a big factor that informs their participation in different international organizations, including at the WTO. So there are many angles to this narrative, is what I'm trying to say. There is an element of protectionism, or one might call it digital industrial policy, depending on whose perspective you're looking at it. There are also genuine concerns, right? There are concerns regarding jurisdictional conflict over data. Because if, let's say, the United States has legislation such as the Cloud Act, then you're genuinely concerned that even if the data is within your country, who really gets access to it if a US company is providing the service? There is also concern of weaponization of these networks and the data that flows through these networks, because again, there are very few players in the market who control these technologies. And there's an element of state control, which I think also you flagged in your question, which is where's this data being stored, with whom it's being shared, and the government wanting to also kind of take some control over who the beneficiaries are in
So let's double
deciding the
click. I'll
narrative.
interrupt you for 1 second there because
Yeah,
there is a lot to unpack,
yeah.
and so that we don't get ahead of ourselves. Uh, Now, you mentioned many important things there.
Yeah,
One, a question around cross-jurisdictional conflicts over data,
yeah.
particularly with domestic legislation such as the Cloud Act, which gives a certain degree of access.
Mhm.
Number two is that there is an element of digital industrial policy and protectionism where people are, and the state also is interested in ensuring that the data is stored locally, the data is processed locally. There might be some innovation concerns there. And here, to put a specific point to this question, I want to talk about data localization, because data localization has been an on-off switch amongst Indian
Mm,
policymakers. In the first draft of the Personal Data Protection Bill, data localization was provided for. The RBI also provided it in its mandate to companies storing financial data. So there was that, which was around circa 2018-19. Then during COVID, as in there was again a move away from data localization to saying that no, we don't need to localize it at all. No hard localization, no soft localization, no localization of any kind is needed, whether it is the data itself or a mirror of that data.
mm,
Suddenly we find, although the narrative had gone there, but in 2024, when the
mhm.
DPDP, as in its latest form, is seen, then we see that localization has made a return, again in some shape or form. So, how do you see this question of localization? Is this genuine policy to ensure protection of data? Is it something else, or is it, again, as you use the expression yourself, not black and white?
I think the idea of data localization is it can cover all forms of it covers a variety of interests, some of which could be good interests and some of which could be bad interests. So in that sense, it's a bit like a double-edged sword, right? Because as you said, there are many valid reasons for data localization. Protectionism is, of course, a concern that has often been flagged, especially in my field. Trade scholars can constantly give you all this legal analysis of how data localization breaches the various obligations in trade agreements. And it is something that countries can genuinely use, especially big markets like India can use to drive their domestic sector. And we have actually seen investment into Indian digital economy from big tech companies increase over the years. Now, there are many reasons for that, one of which is the size of the Indian market. There are also other political considerations around it. But there are also other concerns around data localizations which can sound very genuine. For instance, there can be national security considerations, although it's worth thinking that data security is a function of technology rather than location. So simply because your data is in an Indian server does not make it safe. It's safe when the technology that is used to secure those servers is safe. And sometimes having data in one particular location can actually make them unsafe because they are still connected to
Honeypot
global.
problem. Yeah.
The honeypot problem. Then there's question of access to data, which I think I already mentioned. But it's also worth thinking here even if you have data stored in your local servers, it could be encrypted, which means then you have to think of other domestic legal instruments that you can use to get that data in the decrypted forms. If, let's say, you're investigating a particular crime or you need it in some kind
Sure.
of regulatory action. Then there's the question of, people or countries that have access to data often can conduct more sophisticated intelligence operations, which is something that is discussed lesser. But that's also a big factor that can drive data localization, because the feeling always is that if there is something within my jurisdiction, then I have more control over it.
Absolutely. I mean, we
Then
can, of
there,
course, I mean, there's that Patriot Act and the FISA court, and what happens,
yes,
at least as far as American intelligence access to data ostensibly of non-Americans, but as we know, it's data of Americans as well,
yes,
sometimes
yes,
violating constitutional protections. But Neha, if I may
yeah,
frame this question in terms of the trilemma that you
yeah,
initially started this out
mm,
with, what impact broadly, and I know that these are broad brush strokes,
mm,
and as an academic, as in you will be antithetical to broad brushstrokes, but I'm going to try. The trilemma: what impact does data localization have on innovation? You've spoken about privacy, so let's leave that
mm,
for a moment.
mhm,
And consumer choice. Does it
mhm,
restrict innovation in a way in which companies have claimed that it
yeah,
really doesn't allow us to do the kinds of
yeah,
things? And for consumer choice, as in now every time I need to subscribe to an American or a British newspaper, I mean, there's a really complicated process by which, I mean, at least for a couple of years, it was really complicated, open a PayPal account and so on and so forth,
yeah.
because they were not localizing data.
Mhm.
So, what impact do you think it has in terms of this trilemma that you identified?
Well, I think again, I'm not sure how to answer it in a broad brush manner, because it really depends on the economy you're talking about. Because data localization can be a very effective economic strategy in certain contexts. At least studies show that if you have a large economy like India or Indonesia, then to some extent, data localization can be a very successful strategy, because you force a lot of companies to come into your country to set up servers there, to set up bigger business establishments within the country, and that can generate more opportunities. It also means that you can create more opportunities for domestic companies, because they have a large market to tap into, which is one of the reasons why China was very, very successful. One of the reasons, of course, there are many reasons why it became such a successful digital economy, but the large market size can be a big factor. In a country like India, another big plus is the amount of talent available in the country. There is a lot of engineering talent. There's a lot of there are a lot of people who are willing to take on new initiatives, launch new digital services, new apps, new technologies. So, so this doesn't work in all contexts. You could be a small developing country in Africa trying to replicate the Indian model, and it might be a big failure. So it's important to be very careful in terms of thinking about it as a successful economic strategy in
Sure.
different
But
contexts.
let's take one of the reasons why data localization is often touted as good policy in India. You mentioned, of course, market size, but there's also this question of setting up data centers as a
Yeah.
result of localization policies, and we've seen this that outside, particularly outside Chennai and outside Bombay, I mean, there are large data centers
Mm,
that are coming up, and it's touted, of course, as sort of course, creating jobs apart from fulfilling the localization mandate. On the other side, I mean, there are the concerns in relation to energy consumption, as in how do you provide 24/7 energy to this. There are questions in terms of actually how many jobs does it create. I mean, at the end of the day,
correct.
it's a data center, so really can't be that many. So where do you stand on this issue of growth of data centers, particularly as India's digital economy grows?
So, so I think it's not. So you're right to, and this is there's a lot of studies which show that actually data centers. It's much better for data centers to be in the colder parts of the world, because it's
Exactly.
energy efficient. And you're right. It's also a lot of studies also have shown that even if you set up a data center, it by itself it doesn't generate a lot of employment. You don't. It's a lot of operations are automated, so you don't need that many people to run data centers. So the advantage of having data centers within the country is really how it triggers the digital economy. So one of the problems, which maybe a lot of your listeners are aware, in Latin America, there aren't that many data centers in that region. The concentration of data centers is quite low, and so the same is true for Africa, because of which there's a lot of latency concerns in those regions. So if you're ever in Africa and you want to, in many countries in Africa, and you want to open an email, it's really slow. And that's because, you have to contact a server very far away in Europe or somewhere to get access to your email. So the downloads can be very slow. And that kind of also affects business efficiency in many of these countries. So there are also technological considerations that can make data localization a good choice. I don't know if this is necessarily seen from, at least from an internet policy perspective. It's more seen as a regional concern rather than it should be within my country, but there should be more in the South Asian region, for instance, so that all South Asian countries have faster access to data. So that's one aspect that one should not forget, that, and that's the reason why it can trigger a lot of other growth of other markets, digital markets within the domestic economy. Having said that, there are consumer costs to be, and you mentioned the example of trying to subscribe to the US service and, facing all these different roadblocks because there are different data localization mandates that these service suppliers have to comply with. But what might be helpful to, and this is also a cost benefit analysis for each country to conduct, which is that if the costs or the quality, if the cost of services go up, if you have a very strong data localization mandate, or if the service quality goes down, then it might again affect your domestic sector. And the companies which get affected the most are the small size enterprises who want to innovate and want to do something new, because everything gets more and more expensive for them. So it's, again, I think it's not a broad brush answer. It's very context specific. For a country like India, as I said, there can be obvious advantages. There can be obvious disadvantages as well. So for instance, India is a big player in the digital services market, like the digital services market in terms of exports. And very strong data localization mandates might also harm their own interests because their companies are also exporting worldwide. And if there is tit for tat protectionism, then it doesn't really play out well for India. And that might also explain why India's policy stance has, kind of oscillated between the years, because on the one hand, there are these national interests, and there's also a political narrative around data localization. On the other hand, there are genuine business concerns and economic concerns. And I think it's very hard for a government to balance both of them when they are making decisions.
That's right. So maybe what we can do is that we can cut up this problem, because
Yeah,
the fact is that this is now being painted as kind of a ideological issue of data
correct.
localization as part of data colonization. But as we know, there are different kinds of data. There should be different kinds of restrictions. So let's talk about non-personal data, because my sense is, as in having been involved with the Sri Krishna committee to draft the first data protection bill, the fact is that when we think about these data localization concerns, as in I think the kind of data that a policymaker has in mind is personal data of citizens. Okay, it's personal data of citizens which it doesn't want to go or wanted to go abroad for a range of security and sovereignty considerations. But perhaps many of this will not apply to non-personal data, which is seen more as, and I'm again using a generalization, in the domain of business. Okay, so in that sense, how do you think we should think about non-personal data being regulated from a localization perspective? Yes, but more generally.
It's interesting you bring up non-personal data, Orgo, because so India is one, actually, alongside the EU. I think India has been one of the early starters in the non-personal data regulation space. And my idea of the existing, it's not there's no binding law, but the frameworks that had the draft frameworks that have been put out there is that non-personal data sharing can be very valuable for the economy. It can create more opportunities for new companies to come up, and it can also build more community-based systems within the country. I mean, that's the broad idea that I get from the framework. It's And the way non-personal data is defined in India, and I think in the EU, if you've looked at the Data Act, or if your listeners have read the Data Act or the Data Governance Act, is that non-personal data is something basically that's not personal data. So there's this clear distinction between personal data and non-personal data. A lot of data protection scholars will tell you this distinction doesn't always exist so clearly in practice. So even when you think of something as non-personal data, it might still pose privacy concerns. So for instance, you might, and this is true for businesses, most businesses have mixed data sets, which means there's personal data and there's non-personal data in the same data set, and they have to spend a lot of resources to separate those data in different categories and then treat them separately. The second thing is anonymization technologies, which are used to anonymize personal data, don't always work. And sometimes even if data is anonymized, uh, you might be able to um, de-identify individuals using other data points. And even when you have group-based data, there can be group privacy concerns. You can know who are these people, what community do they belong to, which part of the city they come from. So even when you're thinking of non-personal data, privacy does not, you cannot set aside privacy. There can still be very clear privacy concerns. And I think it's important to have that at the heart of non-personal data regulation. In the Indian context, as you said, there's a lot of understanding of the value of non-personal data. I think the idea is also that it's a national asset that can be used to generate more value in the economy. But the existing frameworks, I perhaps think there are few questions that can, because it's still in a draft stage and that's something that's still being built up. It's worth thinking about the role of data intermediaries or data trustees, whatever the term is that is finally used, because there are conflict of interest considerations to be taken into account. It's also important to understand that when you create a mandatory data sharing requirement, it should be something that makes sense for businesses, because especially if it's a small business and they've spent a lot of resources creating their data resources and their mandatory data sharing requirements, they might have very little incentive to then, because it may not be even beneficial for them. So it's worth thinking there are a lot of market interests that states do not always necessarily understand. And understanding the market value of data, when you can say that, well, will you can impose a reasonable fee, but understanding the market value of data is actually quite complicated in practice. I think it's also worth thinking about the conflict with other existing laws, especially intellectual property law and competition law. And there's been a lot of discussion in the EU in that regard as well, because it's not so clear, especially if you have a new regulator in the space, who's going to deal with what and how will these different conflicts of interest be dealt with in the real world practices. And finally, I think the amount of discretion you give to the government in terms of mandating data sharing, determining the price of data, the executive discretion is something worth thinking about. And for
Exactly.
India, it's a very interesting example, because while the legal frameworks are still being put in place, even the personal data protection law is still not fully being implemented. We have a techno-political framework already in place for data sharing, and it is quite extensive and it's quite embedded within the architecture of the system. And it's worth thinking what the costs of that could be, both in terms of generating innovation, where I think it will be a plus, but also in terms of how it might harm not just individual interests, but also interests at the group level. So it's a very hard balancing exercise between the
That's
two.
right.
And I think the Indian government and any other government that is dealing with non-personal data regulation should not sideline privacy as an issue. It can still very much be a part of that narrative.
Absolutely, because at the end of the day, there is really no gold standard of anonymization where someone cannot be de anonymized. So, that line, as you rightly said, is a blurred one. So, a last question, and let's widen the horizon a little bit, because we are having this conversation at a time when there are two wars being fought: Iran and Israel, Ukraine and Russia, and India and Pakistan have just ended hostilities after the attack in Pahalgam and Operation Sindhu. So, in that context, given the fact that data A is a critical asset, uh, B, that all these wars are very different from the way in which wars used to be fought before, they are essentially wars that are based on technological prowess of different countries, and we certainly see that playing out in Israel and Iran, and also as to dependencies in terms of what you said earlier, who is making the technology. So the fact that India, in its foreign policy in this Israel-Iran war, is trying to walk some very delicate tightrope, and I'm speculating here, may have a lot to do with the fact that Israel is a big supplier of military technology to India. So, given the fact that you work on digital trade and we are having this discussion at a time when the world unfortunately is rife with wars, how do you see the role of sovereignty, particularly in light of military technologies, and control over technology as well as cybersecurity generally?
Now, I think from an international legal perspective, there are various ways of looking at the situation, and there are different subfields of international law which become relevant in different ways. Um, I work a lot in international economic law, so perhaps I can speak to that. Now, what has happened in digital trade space within international economic law is that the security exception, so maybe many of your listeners might know, in a trade agreement, there are different obligations that you have, that you allow market access, you don't discriminate against foreign companies or foreign services, but they're all subject to exceptions. And some of those exceptions are more general public policy exceptions. So things like privacy would be a general public policy exception. And then you have security exceptions, which deal with national security interests or essential security interests. Now, what has happened in the digital trade space is that we have seen more countries becoming conscious about what they are committing to in their security exceptions. Again, the standard clause for security exception comes from the WTO times, which is quite broadly worded. And it usually applies in only very specific circumstances, war being one of them. So if there is an ongoing war or some kind of international emergency in international an emergency in international relations, then you can invoke the security exception. So once you can invoke the security exception, that basically means, let's say I have a data localization measure, or let's say I have something that prevents me, that allows me to prohibit companies from a particular adversary country from providing any services within my market. Those things can be justified under the security exception. Even if they breach certain trade rules, it's all right because I'm doing it for my essential security interests. Now, what has happened is that you're talking about wars, but actually when wars break out, the conflicts actually spread beyond those regions, right? In the sense that you then decide what kind of technologies are safe for you, you decide what kind of weapons, what kind of networks can be weaponized, and hence you're reluctant to import certain technologies, or you want to import certain kinds of technologies from certain countries that you see as allies in that scenario. So as a result of it, a lot of countries now rely upon the security exception quite a bit when they are designing their digital laws and regulations. And as I said, if you're in a state of war, of course, international economic law provides a lot of policy space. But we have been seeing conflicts in the tech space, not necessarily in the form of a war, but in terms of very strong divide, especially between the United States and China. So essentially what has happened in the last maybe decade is that the kind of security exceptions you see in new trade agreements, especially in the digital trade or electronic commerce chapters, are really wide. They provide a lot of discretion to the country to make judgments. So it is very much a self-judging exception. I decide what is my essential security interest, and that's something that cannot be challenged, or that is not negotiable. Let's say if there's a trade dispute, you cannot bring it up before the trade tribunal. So there's a shift in understanding within the community, and there's now gradually also the shift in vocabulary of the treaty exceptions that we are seeing. So that's a very interesting development from the international economic law perspective. Of course, it has its costs as well, because security exception is meant to be used as a last minute, it's like the last resort. When you have nothing else, you rely upon the security exception. Normalizing that also means a breakdown of the global economic order. And that's something that's worth thinking about, also worrying about, because ultimately we are living in an integrated digital economy, and there's only that much that these unilateral policies can be effective in the long run, and they might actually harm innovation and growth in the digital economy than promoting it.
I think anyone interested in international trade and a global world order will be quite worried with what's going on, not just in the wars, but also in the United States of America, which is the elephant in the room as far as
Mm.
trade discussions are concerned. So I think this is genuinely an inflection point, and I think we've covered a range of issues relating to the global south, particularly, but also more importantly to the future of data in the global digital economy. Neha, thanks very much for joining us. That was a really illuminating conversation, and I hope to have many more of these with you. And thank you to all the listeners for joining in, and I look forward to seeing you again.
A big thanks from my side to all, to your listeners and to Orgo especially, and the Vidhi Center for inviting me.